discuss a topic that is often debated, which is sovereignty, realism, vs. human intervention, human rights. The key to the discussion in this topic is to see whether humanitarian intervention undermines a country's sovereignty in upholding human rights. This is because the main purpose of a humanitarian intervention must be universal and humanitarian, rather than having political and strategic intentions. Sovereignty means a country's independent authority and the right to govern itself. This means that the existing power has the right to determine anything for its country without the need for intervention by external powers or directed by certain parties. In other words, other countries should not interfere in the internal affairs of other countries. Humanitarian intervention is a means to prevent or stop a gross violation of human rights in a state where such state is either incapable or unwilling to protect its own people, or is actively persecuting them. There are also some specifics said that the use of military intervention in a state to achieve socioeconomic objectives, such as keeping people alive and communities functioning by providing basic necessities, without the approval of its authorities. Let's see how the realist view of sovereignty. Realism is extremely realistic as a theoretical framework for analyzing conflict in the contemporary international system. Realism emphasizes the persistent role of sovereign territorial nation-states in international relations, although it does not account for the emergence of non-state actors and violent terrorist organizations. Realism assumes that states practice self-help to ensure the state's survival by means of power, which is measured in terms of military capabilities. However, it does not acknowledge international institutions that are supposed to foster economic cooperation and reduce the need for power maximization. Realism is state-centric, because realists view sovereign nation-states as the only legitimate monopolist over the use of force, which focuses solely on state behavior. Realism proposes the ideas of self-help and survival, which imply that states must fend for themselves and cannot rely on others for protection, and that statesmen seek to preserve the existence of the state. Humanitarian intervention. Actions undertaken by an organization or organizations, usually a state or a coalition of states, that are intended to alleviate extensive human suffering within the borders of a sovereign state. Such suffering tends to be the result of a government instigating, facilitating, or ignoring the abuse of groups falling within its jurisdiction. This abuse often takes the form of deliberate and systematic violations of human rights, including forced expulsions, ethnic cleansing, and, in the most extreme cases, genocide. Humanitarian intervention can apply also in situations where there is no effective government and civil order consequently has collapsed. Humanitarian intervention constitutes a calculated and uninvited breach of sovereignty, state rights, in the name of humanity, individual rights. Though humanitarian interventions do not necessarily require the employment of military force, as they could include, for example, the imposition of sanctions, the term refers normally to situations in which force, or the threat of force, is used. Humanitarian intervention has become a major focus of debate within governments, international organizations, and think tanks, and across a variety of academic fields, including international and comparative law, international relations, political science, and moral and political philosophy. Numerous contentious issues frame the debate. Some are theoretical, others practical. Probably the most intractable relate to the question of legitimacy, both legal and moral. Who is to judge an intervention legitimate, and on what grounds? Much of the legal debate stems from the tension of the UN Charter, which grant the Security Council powers to take whatever measures it regards as necessary to re-establish international peace and security. If an act is deemed to threaten peace and security, the UN can empower agents to rectify this, as occurred in the Bosnian conflict, 1992 to 1995. Let's see what the relevant articles in UN Charter said. Article 1, Clause 3 state, the purposes of the United Nations to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character, and in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. In Article 2, Clause 3 mention the organization and its members shall act in accordance with the principles where all members shall settle their international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not in danger. In Article 55, with a view to the creation of conditions of stability and well-being which are necessary for peaceful and friendly relations among nations, based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, the United Nations shall promote all those three elements. In Article 56, all members pledge themselves to take joint and separate action in cooperation with the organization for the achievement of the purposes set forth in Article 55. Apart from that, there are also various multilateral treaties that have been created to ensure that human rights are protected. In fact, there are treaties that limit state sovereignty in ensuring that human rights are not overlooked. It should be emphasized here that although nothing in these treaties has specific provisions that allow intervention in other countries, the main value of the international community is to respect human rights, at least to a degree beyond state sovereignty. However, legal and moral obligations have clashed. In Kosovo, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization (NATO) intervened without UN authorization, claiming that although such authorization was unlikely to be granted, there was nevertheless an overwhelming ethical imperative to act. The controversy in 2001 over intervention in Kosovo and concerns among developing countries about attacks on their national sovereignty led International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty (ISIS) to study the concept of R2P in depth. With that in mind, ISIS developed the responsibility to protect R2P as a framework that outlines the actions of the international community to prevent and respond to large-scale criminal threats. Such actions are like ethnic cleansing or even mass loss of life. As such, R2P aims to limit the use of the armed forces, provide guidance for international action that focuses on the protection of civilians from elements of atrocities, as well as strengthening international order. In other words, R2P is not a tool that works to allow arbitrary armed intervention. Due to the expansion of R2P, which manifests positive value, on its reviewers and supporters have analyzed R2P as an emerging international norm. R2P consists of three frameworks or pillars that distribute responsibilities, namely the protection of the people is the main responsibility of the country. If the state fails, the responsibility will fall to the domestic authorities by taking responsibility in cooperation with external parties. Further, if it still fails, the responsibility will fall on the shoulders of the international community. If preventive action fails to curb or resolve the situation, whether a country is unable to do so or is unwilling to do so, then the international community will intervene by force to avoid severe sacrifices. These measures will likely include economic, political, judicial action, and the most extreme or last action is the military. Even if military action needs to be taken, there are still 6 criteria that need to be followed, namely just cause, threshold, right intention, last resort, proportional means, reasonable prospects, and right authority. During 2011, due to the rapid escalation of violence during the uprising and the genocide in Benghazi, Libya, the UN Security Council has allowed armed intervention to be carried out to protect civilians in Libya. This is the first time the UN Security Council has implemented the R2P doctrine to allow the international community to carry out military intervention to protect civilians, even though the previous doctrine was the responsibility of those states. Therefore, NATO leading the operation to prevent the advance of Gaddafi's forces to Benghazi is based on Security Council Resolution 1973. With the success of the intervention in Libya, the R2P model was praised and raised to be implemented. Let's see how military humanitarian intervention under name of R2P in Libya legalized.
I think one of the problems with the concept is that people focus only on the military side of R2P, which is to be used as a last resort when there's no other avenues open to protecting civilians. The NATO intervention was done with the UN Security Council approval. They tried to actually negotiate with Gaddafi. He dismissed anything or any responsibility for what he was doing. And NATO was left with no choice but to actually take military action before the city of Benghazi was going to be leveled to the ground by the Libyan military. When Gaddafi went house to house, or when he said he was going to go house to house, saying over the radio airwaves he was going to go house to house and kill the cockroaches, that sent off a warning signal to many capitals across the globe that realized that they must take military action, otherwise a city of 500,000 people would have been destroyed. I think the problem with R2P is that people misunderstand that it's actually a legitimate concept, that it's supported by international law. And the case in Libya, it was also supported by many of the regional governments in the Arab world.
However, there are still weaknesses in the implementation of humanitarian interventions that lead to criticism of this concept. For many detractors, it represents a mode of liberal imperialism. Likewise, humanitarian intervention has been censured for coercively imposing Western ideas about rights onto other cultures. For others, humanitarianism is simply rhetorical cover, either for the implementation of traditional geopolitical policies or for powerful economic interests. In particular, it is argued the failure of the Western powers to intervene during the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, where there were no obvious economic or political interests at stake, demonstrated their hypocrisy. Indeed, Rwanda has become a lightning rod for the debate. For critics of interventionism, it proved that interventions were linked to self-interest. For advocates, Rwanda was a catastrophic failure and a spur for future action. Aside from questions of legitimacy, there are other problems to be confronted. There is a practical issue. Even if interventions were regarded universally as legitimate, there exists no consensus about whether they actually work, or whether they delay or even exacerbate the problems they seek to resolve. The question of motivation is also problematic. Is it ever really possible to act solely for humanitarian reasons? Moreover, should motivation actually matter? This all depends on what ethical system is employed. If it is simply a matter of consequences, as a utilitarian might argue, then an intervention conducted purely in the name of national self-interest that resulted in a humanitarian outcome, for example, the overthrow of a genocidal leader, could be classified as a humanitarian intervention. Likewise, an intervention conducted out of concern for human rights, if it failed in its primary goal, could not be classified as such. Same as the security situation in the country deteriorating after the end of the operation on October 31 in Libya, observers began to question the relevance of the intervention operation and support for Libya's post-war transition. Just as Russia criticized the action by believing that the intervention had exacerbated the situation in Libya, even though its basic intention was to protect civilians. Russia considers that NATO has exceeded the scope of the mandate given to it. Participating in the criticism were also countries from the Arab League, the African Union and other countries who stated that NATO's actions went beyond the framework of the resolution on the basis of all efforts directed for a change of government in Libya. From 2011 to 2020, the country remained in a state of civil war due to the crisis of legitimacy of governance. Let our hear Janine Davidson from Council on Foreign Relations Senior Fellow for Defense Policy, reviews on policy considerations surrounding humanitarian intervention.
Military humanitarian intervention is when civilians are under stress, when they are starving or under attack, and the international community, maybe the United States, decides that they need to go in and help these people, and that in order to do that, they're going to need the military for logistics or for protection. The responsibility to protect is an international norm. What it basically means is that it is the responsibility of governments to protect civilians, and that if they can't do that, that it's the international community's right and responsibility to intervene in order to help those civilians. The human rights community considers it an incredible evolution of norms. On the other hand, this can be considered a violation of sovereignty. I mean, who gets to decide if somebody's going to come into my country and intervene because I'm not taking care of my people? There's definitely a balance there. Humanitarian interventions vary widely. You can have a natural disaster, in which case you're basically bringing in medical supplies and food and water. In a conflict zone, you may have to be really protecting civilians from combatants, as well as providing for their basic needs. Those sorts of interventions can be a lot more complex because you have to determine whether or not you're going to get involved in the conflict in order to start saving people's lives. A classic one was in Somalia, where the United States intervened because people were starving. They thought they were intervening in a famine. When they got there and they realized that actually the causes of the famine were warlord conflict, it quickly started to escalate. This is the infamous Black Hawk Down situation, where in an effort to take the fight to the warlords, one of our helicopters was shot down. Some 18 Americans were killed. After that, the idea of going into a humanitarian intervention was just not very palatable politically in America. It led to reticence to get involved in the horrible genocide happening in Rwanda. But we have also done humanitarian assistance in the Balkans. We've done all kinds of disaster assistance. Deciding whether or not to conduct a humanitarian intervention is not easy. You have the sovereignty issue, and you have to think about what are the root causes of the crisis. If it's a civil war, now you're sort of blurring the lines between a humanitarian intervention on the one hand and peacekeeping on another. And do you have international authority to do that? So you have to think about the politics. The second thing you're going to have to think about is how hard is this going to be? How far away is it? These are just basic military logistics. One of the other considerations is how long are you going to stay? People always talk about exit strategies, and they're easier said than done. Another thing to consider when you're thinking about doing a humanitarian intervention is whether it will be unilateral or multilateral. You'll definitely have more legitimacy if the UN has decided that this is an R2P situation and other countries are going to get involved and help you. That said, it complicates things. I mean, it's much easier to just do things by yourself, especially when you have the kinds of capabilities that the United States has. Humanitarian intervention, disaster relief, our military has been doing this for years, but they haven't really considered it as sort of their core responsibility. However, they get called to do this all the time. And so there's a lot of controversy inside the Pentagon about whether or not they need to be organizing, training, and equipping and preparing to do this sort of a mission as a primary role for them.
Basically, international political thinkers, especially realists, place the sovereignty/interests of the country as the most important thing beyond all aspects. Yet, in the era after the Second World War, the existence of the international political arena has brought a new paradigm in which views on the world stage must also be taken into account, as is the existence of new norms on international level intervention to promote human rights and social progress, especially for backward countries. Despite the existence of this norm, the principle of sovereignty of a country is still respected by giving space to the government of that country to take action, first to resolve existing conflicts. Yet, there is no denying that there are a handful of greedy leaders who do not want to abide by what is consensus reached at the international community level. Therefore, with the allocation of agreed powers to the authorized parties, coercive action needs to be taken to prevent the bad situation from protracting or becoming more tragic.
Created using Powtoon.